Today's video is about a very fun, very hectic, and very sexual RPG, Divinity: Original Sin 2. Divinity is a turn-based role-playing game that you can either play by yourself or with your soon-to-be ex-friends. You'll have to talk, fight, or think your way out of any problems the game might throw at you. Giant troll blocking a bridge? Just kill it. Troll wiped your whole party? Pay the troll toll and weep for your lost shekels. Divinity doesn't use classes, and instead allows you to customize your character however you want, by putting points into any combination of skills. You can be anything from a powerful mage that summons storms and fires lightning from their hands, to some hobo that does multiple health bars worth of damage just by swinging a small bag around. To top it off, this can even be done in stealth to end the fight before it even starts. So, needless to say, this game's mechanics work flawlessly, and none of it should be questioned. Which is partially why I love it so much. You can never tell if something is intended by the developers, or just plain broken. Divinity also throws homage to one of my favorite scenes from the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy.
Pizza time.
The story of Divinity is honestly one of the best parts, and so I'm going to try to give a quick rundown with as few spoilers as possible. You and your 1 to 3 acquaintances are Source users. Source is essentially the world's energy, and unlike normal magic, casting spells with Source summons creatures called Voidwoken. And these things are absolutely terrifying. So the Magisters, who are essentially the Spanish Inquisition, gather as many Source users as possible, slap a collar on them that prevents them from using Source, and then sends them off to Fort Joy. And that's where you're going. So obviously, your main goal is to get the hell out. And you have a ton of options to do this. You can try using a boat, teleporting out, or my personal favorite way, murdering all of the Magisters and walking out with a ton of XP. After escaping Fort Joy, you quickly find out that the 7 gods are dying, and they need someone to replace them. So your job is to become a more powerful Source user and eventually rise to Divinity. Because, you know, that's the title. Or you can do the exact opposite of that and piss the gods off. But what are they gonna do about it? They're no more powerful than Ricky Berwick by the time you meet them. You can choose to play as one of 6 story-driven characters, known as origin characters, or create a custom character that just sort of does whatever they want with no real rhyme or reason. And if you play the game, I highly recommend at least one person in your party be an origin character. The story feels so much more fleshed out with one thrown into the mix, and mixing a few of them together just makes it that much better. The origin characters include Ifin, a mercenary who wants to kill Lucian. Lucian, by the way, is basically this game's version of Jesus Christ, which effectively turns Ifin into the divinity equivalent of the Jewish people. Sabile, an ex-slave assassin who is now hunting down her ex-master. Sabile's story has a lot of killing in it, so if you enjoy senseless murder, Sabile is the right character for you. The Red Prince, who is the heir to the Red Lizards, and is one of my favorite characters, purely due to the fact that early on he can seduce a fire slug, and then murder it. And that will forever give him a special place in my heart. Lohse, who is by far my favorite character in Divinity. Lohse is possessed by a demon that sometimes talks to her about girl things, and other times it decides to make her kill all the elves around her. But then again, nobody really likes elves, so is it really a problem? Beast, a dwarf who tried to dethrone the Dwarven Queen, and that's all I know about him, since I've yet to have him in my party, and I intend to keep it that way. And finally Fane, who is an Eternal. He's also one of the better written characters in my opinion. He's witty, he's lovable, he's Fane. However, if you wanted to make a custom character, there are plenty of options. One of my favorite custom characters was an elf I named Herrick. Herrick's prime goal in life was to find and collect as many pairs of used panties as possible. He was truly the most noble of souls. And he usually looked pretty retarded. But then again, given how I acted, he might have actually been retarded. When making a character in Divinity, you can be a human, elf, dwarf, lizard, or undead. Humans are about what you would expect in any fantasy setting. They're highly adaptable and can do just about anything. They also single-handedly gassed an entire race of inferior people, just because they lived in trees and occasionally ate corpses. Playing as a human gives you racial privilege and causes the lesser races to despise you because of it. Humans are able to encourage their allies in combat and also gain a natural crit chance and bartering bonus. But none of these other perks compare to the power of being the superior race. Elves are tree-hugging hippies who can eat corpses to learn new skills, see visions of the past, and have the ability to go through high school angst at will. They also happen to have a face that looks suspiciously like they've gone through more than a few generations of excessive inbreeding. But due to the fact that most of them were cleansed, I mean murdered, I don't think you can blame them. If I'm making them sound like a particular race of real-life people I compared Ifin to, that's because Ifin was raised by elves, and I'm pretty sure you can connect the dots. Dwarves are basically the same in Divinity as in every other fantasy setting. They're loud, short, and life would be better without them. Dwarves get a bonus to vitality, sneaking, and can petrify things they touch. They're not terrible, but if you play a dwarf in my game, I'm likely to never talk to you again. Lizards are stuck up, snobby, and have really nice headgear. Lizards get a buff to persuasion, can breathe fire, and get a small fire and poison resistance buff. They're also able to dig without a shovel, which is honestly pretty useless, considering shovels are all over the place. Lizards in Divinity have a lot of interesting lore behind them, but unfortunately, you don't pay me enough to talk about that. You can, however, pay one to have sex with you, and that's worth something? Probably. Undead can be any of the previous races and are probably the most unique race in Divinity, because they take damage from healing and instead heal from poison damage. And, the enemies know this. Undead are also immune to Death Fog, which doesn't have the biggest impact on the game, besides collecting a few items and cheesing a few fights, if you know what you're doing. They also gain one of the most powerful abilities in the game, playing dead. Undead change how the game's played a lot, and it's worth trying one out. Geomancy in particular has a few poison abilities, and turning yourself into a poison dot tank is pretty fun. After choosing a race, you have to pick a class, but these don't really matter. Once you get into the game, you can pretty much build your character however you want, and I'd honestly just say pick the one that has the spells that sound either the most fun to start with, or the ones that you can most likely kill a teammate with. You also have to put points into attributes, which give small increases to your damage, survivability, or impacts who goes first in combat. As far as skills go, if you want to create massive explosions and possibly lag out some of your friends with weaker computers, you should focus on pyrokinetics. It's a very fun and hectic skill, since it's very likely you'll forget that poison is actually flammable and kill your own party. Magic in general is pretty chaotic in Divinity, because anything on the ground will likely react to a spell you cast. Geomancy has some pretty good CC, damage, and utility, while also being able to create pools of poison and oil. It's definitely not bad on its own or as a secondary skill, but I would highly recommend mixing it with pyrokinetics to get the most bang for your buck. They just mix so well together that it's pretty insane. Aerothurge is, in my opinion, the most satisfying magic type, and nothing feels nearly as good as jumping into a pack of enemies and doing this. Aerothurge has a lot of damage and utility, including a teleport, which is probably the most useful skill in the game. And if you do play Aerothurge, just remember, the tornado doesn't actually do damage. This made me very sad. Hydrosophist is mostly healing and support skills, and while it's definitely not bad, I originally wanted to be an ice mage, and was left very wanting. However, a small patch of ice on the ground is the worst thing in the world, because if you trip, your turn ends instantly. And if that sounds awful, it is. Scoundrel skills resemble a rogue, and you should expect anyone who plays Scoundrel to try and steal all of your gold while you're talking to NPCs. To avoid this, you can put everything into a single bag, because the bag will have too much value for them to steal, and they won't be able to open it to take individual items out. And the fact that I had to learn this should already tell you how I feel about Scoundrel players. Huntsman uses bows and can use elemental arrows to change their damage types or add effects such as charm and knockback. Huntsman requires very little investment to be good, so you can easily mix it with any other skills and make some very creative builds. Warfare is used for anyone wanting to either be the party's tank or reenact the Dark Souls equivalent of Ooga Booga Big Stick. Despite being filled in a world of magic and mythical creatures, there's always something satisfying about wailing on someone with a weapon the size of your own body. And if that sounds like I'm compensating for something, I am. Now, if you wanted to control a legion of elemental beings, you can. But you can get close with summoning. Summoning's damage isn't that great at the start of a fight, due to the fact that you're, well, summoning things, but it ramps up like crazy. Unfortunately, each character can only have one controllable summon, but you can have an army of automated elemental turrets, and being a one-man firing squad is pretty satisfying. There's also this really neat trick you can do with Soulmate, which is an ability that lets you share your healing with another target. You can use it on an undead enemy and drink a massive healing potion to one-shot them. Necromancy and Polymorph, however, feel much more like secondary skills to me. Necromancy is really good for range physical damage and healing, but in my opinion it doesn't have enough skills that work together to be a main skill tree, and Polymorph is in a pretty similar boat. It's mostly just utility and crowd control, and don't get me wrong, they both have some amazing skills, but they have very few damaging abilities and are fairly situational. I just don't think they're very good to focus on, but in general mixing a few different skill types together is usually better than just focusing on one anyway. There's even a few spells that require points in 2 different skills, and excluding a few rarer drops, you typically have to craft these. And if this sounds like a lot to take in, don't worry. At the end of the day, you can pretty much do whatever you want. It's very hard to become useless in Divinity, especially on the lower difficulties. The real beauty of this game is mixing all sorts of skills together and making anything you can imagine. It may not be optimal, but does that really matter when you can become a jihadi devotee? And if you ever want to change something, you can always completely reset your character for free by going to a magic mirror. You have to escape Fort Joy or turn on one of the gift bag mods before you can access the mirror, but it's very hard to fuck your character over that early on. Besides the combat skills, you also have to level up civil abilities. Most of these aren't all that important, however I would say that Persuasion, Thievery, and Lore Master are pretty mandatory. The rest of them definitely aren't useless, but Lore Master is needed to identify gear and view enemy stats, Thievery lets you pick locks and steal from enemies, and Persuasion just helps a lot in general. The other civil abilities feel a lot more like quality of life in comparison, and just so you're aware, Persuasion rolls are also accompanied by Wit, Strength, or any other attribute your character can have points into, and these mean absolutely nothing. The only thing that matters on a Persuasion check is your actual Persuasion. There's also the crafting system, which I will not be talking about, because I have personally never used it. It's not all that complicated or anything, but I just don't care about it, because I opened it up once, saw all the things you could do, and then looked up how to make skill books. Because why should I have to learn it, when someone else can instead? In my opinion, Divinity is definitely worth checking out, and I highly recommend anyone who watches this video try the game out, because it's very well made. The fact that there are so many builds and options in the game means it has a ton of replayability, and if you want to see all of the origin character stories, you'll have to at least do a few playthroughs. But if you don't want to fight the same enemies with different builds, there is an in-game fix. There's a gift bag to randomize the enemies in the game. It's not entirely random, but it at least adds a lot of flair to the encounters, especially if you've already seen them before. You can also change how the game is played with the Steam community mods. There's everything from skill revamps to custom campaigns, and honestly there's just way too much to talk about. And I would highly recommend you explore it yourself. Overall, Divinity is easily one of my favorite games. The only real complaint I have is that half the time I can't get a group of friends together till the end of the game, so at least it's accurate to playing D&D in real life. Speaking of which, the devs are working on Baldur's Gate 3, which is currently in beta, and that game is looking even better, but mostly because the frog girl makes my PP hard. Thank you to all of my patrons for supporting my coffee addiction, and all the viewers for watching the video. Now, I hope you all have a wonderful day. And if you don't, well, fuck you.
Sandwich!